Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comrades, brothers and sisters, my fellow Americans, welcome back to Al Jazeera, your favorite Arabic language news network. This week I'd like to talk to you about training to failure. I've been seeing a lot of videos and Instagram pages in my social media feed that feature Mike Mentzer, Dorian Yates, Sam Sulek, bodybuilders who preach and practice a very high intensity, low volume style of training where they're not doing that many reps and sets, they're not doing that many sessions in a week, but they're training very, very hard within that short period of time, and they're going to failure or past failure in a lot of cases. And even guys like David Goggins, who obviously is not a bodybuilder, he has become very famous for preaching that push it to the limit style, push past the limit, and even the military culture of training in general, at least for younger guys, is very often push it to the limit, do as much as you can, go to failure, that type of thing. So I want to talk about that mentality because it is very prevalent in the fitness and lifting community. And I want to talk about why I don't think it's a good approach to training for most people and what I think you can do that's better. But before we get into that, I think it's important to kind of set the table and say that from what I have seen, there seems to be some disagreement about what training to failure is. Some people classify it as training till you get to a point where you perceive not being able to do anymore. So you get to an RPE 10 or an RIR 0 where you are very confident that you could not do any more reps, and that's to failure. Some people talk about failure being when you can no longer physically complete a rep and the bar has to be lifted up off you, and that's their definition of failure. So everybody's got a little bit of their own twist to the definition of training to failure. So for the sake of this discussion, let's say that failure is somewhere between RIR 0 or RPE 10, where you are very confident that you could not have done any more reps, and wherever actual mechanical failure is where you cannot physically lift the bar anymore and somebody has to lift it up off you. And because most of you are beginner intermediates, there is going to be a good amount of space between those 2 points, and so it's a little bit of an abstraction, but it's good enough for our conversation. The second thing, which probably should have been the first thing to frame the conversation that we'll use, is what is your goal? Are you a bodybuilding hypertrophy focused athlete, or are you more of a strength and conditioning focused athlete like most of you guys that follow me probably are? Because a lot of the people that push training to failure and talk about how important training to failure is, or training very close to failure, they are bodybuilders. They are hypertrophy focused athletes, and that's important to note, because if your goal is to get in really good shape and to get really, really strong while you're getting in shape, you're not necessarily going to train the same way that a high-level bodybuilder is going to train. And so, as always, the answer to our training questions are going to be dictated by what the goal is in large part. So to get into the specifics of why I don't like training close to failure or to failure very often, and why I don't use that approach with my athletes, firstly is because I train to failure or close to failure all the time, several times a week for several years, probably 4 or 5 years. And for the first year or 2 or maybe even 3, that actually yielded me some pretty good results, and I built up a relatively good amount of strength. But after those initial years, and I started to get out of that brand new beginner stage of training, I started to plateau in my strength and kind of start to hover around the same numbers all the time for months and years at a time. And then eventually, as I continued to push, I started getting injured. And so kind of out of necessity, I was forced to lift lighter. And then around the same time, I was beginning to learn more about how other athletes and coaches trained. And I began to run into guys like Chad Wesley Smith, who talked a lot about submaximal training and how important that was. Not lifting at 100% or trying to go for PRs all the time, and simply trying to do multiple reps and multiple sets with 70%, 75%, 85% of your 1 rep max for the majority of your training. And so that's kind of something important to know, is that you can train to failure or close to failure, especially when you're a beginner and you're very young, because you're not that strong. And so your ability to do damage to yourself is not as severe, but also just because you're young and your body can recover and it can kind of take a beating and keep on coming. It doesn't really matter what you throw at it if you're 16 years old. But once you get to a more intermediate advanced strength level and your ability to do damage to your own body becomes higher and higher as you're lifting 300 and 400 and 500 pounds, that becomes not sustainable. And also, as you get older, your body's ability to recover wanes significantly as the years go on. And so that's another factor that you have to consider, that it's just not something that you can do for a long period of time, which is ultimately what dictates a successful athlete. How many successful training sessions, how much productive training can you do over many, many months and years? And when you're constantly pushing your body to its physical limit, you're going to eventually find that physical limit, and you roll the dice and increase your chances of having some type of strain or even more serious injury. So instead of trying to push yourself past that limit all the time, I think it's better to strategically plan your training so that you spend the majority of your time building up your physical capabilities rather than trying to test the maximum of your capabilities. And then once you've spent a good amount of time building yourself up, then you can have those periods where you do push yourself to the limit or very close to it. Which gets me to my second point, that when we push ourselves to that physical limit and go through a extremely intense training session, our body by necessity needs a period of time to recover. And depending upon your age and strength level and a number of different factors, what lift we're talking about, that type of thing, you may need anywhere from 2 days to a week or more to recover from a heavy deadlift, a heavy squat, a heavy bench, something like that. And so you kind of yo-yo between these really, really intense bouts and then having to take time off to recover. And in the session, that's not as productive because you can't get as much work in, because you're doing that one maximum effort set or that one maximum effort lift, and you can't really go and do more productive sets afterwards because you're so fatigued from that one set. But also in a larger scale over days and weeks, you run into the same problem. If you have a really, really hard squat session and your legs and lower back are just destroyed for 5 days, that's 5, 6, 7 days that you're not working out your lower body, that you're trying to recover from that session. And what happens over a long period of time is we actually get less work done because we spend a lot of time trying to recover from these very intense bouts. If we instead take a more incremental and submaximal approach to our training and say, okay, instead of going to the death on this squat workout, I'm going to do 5 sets of 5, and I'm going to add 5 or 10 pounds more than last week. That's still going to be hard. It's still going to be challenging, but you're going to recover quicker, which means you can have another productive training session quicker. And this becomes especially important for those of you guys who are focused on multiple goals at once. So you can imagine doing that killer squat session where you did a 1 rep max and then you did like 8 or 9 back off sets and you're just destroyed. How productive is a deadlift session going to be 4 days later when you're so toast? Are you going to be able to go and run for 3 or 4 or 5 miles the next day? Are you going to be able to go to jiu-jitsu the next day? Probably not. And if you do, the session's probably not going to be that productive because you're so fatigued that you're still recovering. And because you're in that state of trying to recover and your body tissues are compromised, your risk of injury goes up if you go into another hard session after that heavy squat session that you just did, when your body's not at least partly recovered. And something that I try not to get into as much because I want to stay in my lane and I want to focus on, and I want my athletes to focus on ourselves and what we can control, but something that is important to talk about still is that a lot of guys who push this to failure or close to failure philosophy, they're on steroids or they have great genetics. And so I don't want to hang my entire argument on, oh, don't do that, that's only for people who are on steroids or have great genetics, but I do think it's a very big factor when we're talking about something like this, especially as athletes get older. And that reminds me of a coach I used to listen to quite frequently named Max Ayeda. If you're not familiar with him, I would recommend listening to his podcast with Mark Bell. He did the Bulgarian weightlifting system for years, and he would essentially come in not multiple times a week, but twice a day to hit a maximum effort lift on an Olympic lift or one of the variations or accessories like the squat. And he talked about how this ultra high intensity system was not necessarily the best way for people to get stronger, but if you could survive that type of system because of genetics or steroids or a combination of the two, then you were going to be one of the best in the world. And so that's something that you also have to watch out for is that survivor bias of, well, this guy did it and a lot of the guys he worked with did it, and so that means it's good. It's like, well, not necessarily. A lot of these guys that do these high intensity to failure approaches to training, they are on steroids or TRT. They may have very good genetics. They are sleeping 8 hours a night. They are eating 200 grams of protein a day or 150 grams of protein a day or whatever. And so those factors outside the programming itself are also things you need to consider when you're thinking about, should I have this type of approach to my training? But this video has gone on much longer than I wanted it to. I've been trying to keep the videos about 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm long-winded. What can I say? Suffice it to say that I think training to failure, training close to failure on a regular basis for athletes who are focused on being good at a lot of different things, being in shape, being able to do martial arts, having very good strength levels, is not an effective long-term way to train. That doesn't mean we never go to failure. In fact, I think there's periods where you should go to failure or close to it, depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it. But I think for most of you, spending the majority of your training time in the 65 to 85% intensity range is what's going to allow you to stay healthy and make the most progress over a long period of time and ultimately be the best athlete you can be. Thank you guys for listening. Please like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and I will see you later.